everybody. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. I'm here with my, I was about to say colleague, but that seems like, I don't know, that seems like reaching above my level here. I can call him my colleague, but it's sort of like the janitor, at MIT saying that he's colleagues with the professors. We happen to work at the same institution to some extent. So I'm talking about Phil Lawler. He is, of course, the editor of Catholic World News and the commentator on news at CatholicCulture.org. And he's been on the podcast twice in sort of bits and pieces, but this is the first sort of straightforward, full-length interview that we've done on this show. So we'll be discussing today his new book from Sophia Institute Press called Contagious Faith, Why the Church Must Spread Hope, Not Fear, in a Pandemic. And I will go ahead and welcome him on the show. Thanks for coming on, Phil.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you as a colleague.
Well, thank you. Thank you for humoring me. So we actually met for the first time in person recently around Christmas time. We were both in Virginia at a parish that's not even my home parish, but I was just there. I happened to be there for, I think it was a Sunday Mass, and you and your wife were also there, I guess because you have kids or a kid in the region, right?
Right, a child, our daughter, her husband, and their 4 children. So they were all there with us.
Right,
Although
and my
you wouldn't
parents
have recognized them.
Right. Yeah, and my parents, of course, live in the area. So we ran into each other and, we were just chatting, and I said to you, I think that the church's response to this COVID-19 scenario is the most shocking scandal that for me anyway, personally, that's happened in my lifetime. And there have been quite a few. And of course, I'm not making a absolute moral judgment there of what's the worst scandal, right? But I'm just saying, I grew up knowing about, bad clerics and prelates throughout history. And so the idea that some of them would be corrupt in various ways or even abusive, I guess wasn't surprising. And also I was 12 when, the 2002 sex abuse scandals broke. So I pretty much grew up hearing jokes about priests and Michael Jackson, but the idea that they would just sort of stop doing their job, even at the most sort of mechanical level, because even a good, even a terrible priest can do the sacraments validly, and it works. I guess mechanical is not quite the right word, but anyway, to make a long story short, you agreed with me, and that's when you told me that you had this book coming out. So maybe we could start with that. I mean, what is it about this this response to the virus that is so shocking, even on a historical level?
Well, as I think I said to you then, but I didn't say to everybody who's watching this podcast, my experience is like yours in some respects, and others it's unlike. I was fully grown when the sex abuse scandal hit. I was in Boston at Ground Zero. I knew a lot of the people involved personally. It was devastating. And I was researching it. I was writing about it every single day during what Father Richard John Newhouse called the Long Lent. My nose was in it every day. And we were personally touched by it. We had a young man who was living at our house who turned out to have been abused and was, we confronted the abuser. And so yeah, it was a very trying experience for me, but I can't say that it ever shook my faith. It depressed me, it scandalized me, but it didn't shake my faith. This did, because the difference was the church stopped doing what the church does. I mean, I couldn't get to Mass. I could easily understand that there were bad priests. The church is an expert on sin. I could less easily understand that there were bad bishops who were letting the bad priests do their thing. But still, there was Mass every day. There was confession. People were married. People were buried. And then last year, in reaction to something that just was not the threat that it was made out to be, the church closed. I couldn't get to Mass, or I couldn't get to Mass, shall we say, legally. There was no access to confession. You're hearing horrifying stories about elderly people dying alone without the benefit of the sacraments, without being able to meet their children. It was horrifying to me, and that was something I just never could have anticipated. So it was a shock. And the way I react to shocks is usually writing about them.
Right. Yeah. Well, of course, none of this is meant to, this comparison is not meant to, diminish the suffering of especially victims of abuse in any way. But that's why it was so striking to me that you agreed with the comment that I made, because you have been reporting on this and studying it in depth for, at least I have to say a decade before everybody else knew about it, in 2002.
For sure. Yeah. I don't by any means intend to suggest that this is, that the sex abuse scandal was anything less than a horrible scandal. And in fact, I recall saying sometime in the mid-90s, I was on a radio show with Al Cresta, and he asked me, is this abuse scandal, is it going to amount to anything? And he clearly expected the answer would be no. It's a media conspiracy. And I said at the time, and I still believe, it will be the biggest challenge for the church since the Reformation. So it's a huge thing, and I've written a lot about that. I don't mean to suggest that this is swamping that or wiping it out. In fact, I think it's kind of part of the same constellation of problems that the church is facing.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure I probably had some listeners just turn off as soon as I said that this was more shocking than the sex abuse scandal. But, I really am talking about my own reaction. And when I say shock, I wouldn't say my faith was shaken, but surprise. Surprise is something that I never in a million years would have expected. And it's interesting because early on when people were saying things like this back in March and April of 2020, some people were saying, well, hold on a minute. There are precedents. You can't say this is unprecedented. Nothing is new under the sun. Of course, that's true. But they would appeal to the example of Charles Borromeo and what he did in the 16th century in response to a plague, saying that this was essentially, a similar response to what happened in the past year. Can you address that right away? Because I want to sort of get that kind of, is this unprecedented thing out of the way at the beginning.
It is unprecedented. I mean, there have been times when churches closed. That, sometimes churches close because they need renovations, because they're structurally unsound. St. Charles Borromeo did indeed close the cathedral in Milan. He closed the churches. But when he closed the cathedral, he celebrated Mass out in the streets, in the plazas, in the neighborhoods. He did not stop the ministry of the sacraments. In fact, quite the contrary. He told his priests, I recognize that you're in danger because of the plague. However, it is your duty, it's your vocation to minister to the people, and you have to be out there with them, even if there's a risk. And if you're now not out there with them, I will be. And if I'm the last priest in Milan, so be it. It was very clear that he was not going to give up on what priests are ordained to do.
Now, at least in some places, including Rome itself, there were priests being sent out to at least give last rites and things like that, at risk to themselves, and some of them died. Some elderly priests died from this, but there were also quite a number of places where even that was diminished, if not completely, shut down. And of course, the big thing that masses were ceased, almost worldwide for a certain period of time, which is kind of apocalyptic seeming. That response. It's a little scary. I mean, I remember thinking within the first couple of weeks of the lockdown, the powers that be, whether this is the right decision or not, the powers that be are definitely taking note and saying, wow, that was really easy to get them to just stop
Yeah.
going to
Yes.
Mass.
I could have imagined that the Mass would be unavailable in my nightmares, in my nightmare fantasies about, the zombie apocalypse or the communist
Hmm.
takeover or the coming persecution. But
Or that
this
it would be
wasn't a
unavailable due
persecution.
to a free choice by the Catholic Church. That's really the
That's
crux of it.
that's what shocked and scandalized and offended me. Yes, that's what I thought I needed to write about, because I need to point out that this is a largely self-inflicted wound on the church. At the beginning, I was scared. I think everybody was scared. When we
Hmm.
first, in what was it, February and March of 2020, when we heard about this virus and we heard the initial estimates that 30 million people were going to die, 30 million Americans, and so many, such and such a percentage of the people would catch this, and so many people would die. And when we first heard about the lockdown, and it was going to be for a couple of weeks uh, to flatten the curve so that people wouldn't be dying in the hallways of hospitals, at first it didn't strike me as quite so apocalyptic, quite so crazy. But
Hmm.
as time passed and we calmed down a little bit and we learned more, uh, the thing that I found mind-boggling is the less threatening the virus seemed, the more draconian was the lockdown. And we learned more. We learned we aren't all going to die. We are mostly going to survive, even if we get the virus. And yet, more and more uh, insistence that you can't go out, you have to stay home, you can't talk to people, you have to wear a mask. No, you have to wear 2 masks, and so forth. It was just constant escalation of what I referred to as panic porn, and
Right.
nothing else to be discussed. So I guess what I'm saying is I understand to some extent the initial reaction. I don't understand how it was locked down in place.
Right. Okay. So this brings us to your book. The subtitle again is Why the Church Must Spread Hope, Not Fear in a Pandemic. Why don't we ask this question? Uh, how much of this is about fear? Obviously, for some people, it is. Um, but how much of it is really about fear, and how much of it is about being in control? Or how much of it is about fear, and how much of it is about virtue signaling? Because it's not entirely clear to me how many of the people who say they're afraid actually are, or at least it seems like they've made themselves afraid, but it may have started, this overreaction may have started in other ways. I don't quite understand some of the people that I see reacting so in such a neurotic manner to this.
That's a good point. And, when you say, is it about fear or is it about being in control? There are two ways you can take that being in control. One is the people who want to control other people.
Yes, yes, yes.
But the other is the rest of us. And we all want to be in control of our own lives.
Right.
And one of the things that I think might be a salutary reminder here is we aren't in control of our own lives. I mean, we try, but things happen. And one of the things that happens is disease, and it happens to everybody. And there's never a particularly good time to be sick, but you are going to be sick sooner or later. And it's attractive to say, well, okay, I'm not going to be sick. I'm going to do whatever I can to make it impossible to get me sick. And that's foolish. It can't happen. You take reasonable precautions. So, but I think maybe you were talking about the other side of the equation. About
Either one, actually, really, both. But I suppose I am talking about more on the ground, more the latter that you said about people wanting to be in control of their own lives, because the motive of state control, for example, that's pretty obvious. That's a pretty obvious one.
yeah, and it's an obvious one, but again, maybe it's a useful reminder to us because sure, there are people who are by nature inclined to state control, and this has been just, they've hit the jackpot. But there are a lot of people, in local government, in the local board of health, and so forth. And they're ordinary people. I'm not afraid of them ordinarily, but give them a little bit of power, and it's hard for them to let go. And,
Hmm.
because they feel they can make everybody better, and they feel a little bit of a responsibility, not just a little bit, they feel a lot of responsibility. If I ease up on this mask mandate, will people die, and it will be my fault? And
Right.
so I can sort of understand that, although I think
Right.
based on wrong information.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a number of factors here, and one of them is just kind of a general moral and prudential like unmooring in our society, which makes it difficult for people to even make rational judgments of this kind. I mean, how much risk is it willing to accept or to kind of decide that we're going to, you know, take as a society? And the two forms of control, of course, are connected because often people who want to feel like they're in control of their own lives, well, the only way you can do that is by controlling other people
Sure.
or to
Yep.
have the illusion of that. So then you turn to the state. And of course, I'm no longer my libertarian days are, well behind me at this point. So I'm not opposed to the state, even taking drastic measures to regulate people's behavior, at this point in my life. But you know, we're talking about a specific situation in which it's, unnecessary and often immoral. And in the particular context of this conversation, we're speaking about the restriction of religious activities in ways that other activities weren't, being restricted,
Right.
or to degrees that they weren't being restricted, often in quite a number of places. But of course, that the moral problem with shutting down society itself, to not even speak of the church, is nothing to sneeze at either.
No, it's not. And isn't it interesting? There are lots of ways in which the behavior of a lot of people endangers themselves. They endanger themselves, and they endanger society.
Hmm.
People who smoke cigarettes, people who drink to excess, particularly if them they're going to drive. Uh, they're a danger. Uh, People who don't exercise. Where do you draw the line? All of these things you can say, look, you would be better off if you ran a mile a day, if you took more vitamin D, and you can make a pretty good case for that.
Yeah.
Uh, but we as a society treat people like grown-ups, at least we usually do. And we say you should know enough to make your own decisions and to weigh your own risks. And we take risks every day, and we accept risks every day. And
Yeah.
this is one case where our society, or the leaders of our society, have told us we can't take any risks at all. And
Right.
again, that's not rational.
In a previous episode with Douglas Farrow and Andrew Bush, we talked about kind of the rights of the church. We also talked about the political side of this, which we were just discussing, and this kind of this political control, the cult of expertise, things like that. So in this episode, we're going to be largely speaking again about the way that the church has responded to uh, the dictates of civil authorities, or sometimes even gone beyond them. Can you just paint an overall picture? Because obviously people are aware of the widespread shutting down of mass and the sacraments, things like that. But how would you kind of summarize the overall picture of how the church has um, interacted with the dictates of public health authorities or other government officials?
Well, to oversimplify it, because we're painting on a very large canvas here, but to oversimplify, church authorities have generally done whatever public officials did. My favorite example, which I mentioned in the book, is when in Italy, the civil authorities of Rome closed down the street uh, leading into St. Peter's Square. So there was no access to St. Peter's Square. But the Vatican Basilica was still open because, of course, the Vatican is a sovereign territory.
Mm-hmm.
Well, within 2 hours after the city did that, the Vatican closed the basilica. Now, you can say, as the Vatican did say, we did that on our own initiative, but it's awfully coincidental that it happened, within a 2-hour period after the public officials had made the same call. And that, to me, is sort of typical of what I've seen all around the United States. You have the civic officials announcing a lockdown and the church officials announcing the same lockdown. These civic officials then say churches can open and they can have a congregation of up to 50 people, say, and the local bishop says, I've decided that we can have a congregation of up to 50 people. So it's still possible for the bishop to say, I didn't accede to the demands of the civic officials. I made the decision myself. But it's awfully coincidental that it's the very same decision.
Sure. Now, of course, I will say that one probably the only thing that I really took issue with in your book was you suggest in a few places that, perhaps we should question the authority of certain decisions by church officials if they are basically really coming from government bodies or public health authorities. This is a question we should be asking in terms of obedience. And I don't know that I mean, what you're saying is very relevant in terms of critiquing the church's approach to this, but I don't know that that's relevant to the question of obedience, because we have to submit, for example, to encyclicals that are written by people other than the Pope, for instance, but they're promulgated under the Pope's name.
That's fair, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think that just because an order is, really coming from a public health authority, unless the bishop is being outright coerced, sort of in a direct manner, I don't think that they then are not properly still viewed as orders of the bishop.
I guess that's fair. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, yeah, if the order is essentially written by a public official and signed by the bishop, it's still the bishop's order. But there's another factor there, which I also try to make in the book, an argument that I try to make in the book, which is the bishop telling me, is he issuing these instructions? And by the way, I should avoid the term order, because usually they weren't orders. Usually they were instructions or recommendations or requests. But is he issuing them in his role as the leader and teacher of the diocese and successor to the apostles and our father in the faith? Or is he issuing them as a public health official? Because insofar as the bishop is giving out advice on public health, I don't recognize him as an authority in that area.
Yes, that's very interesting. And it's also funny because, I've just been reading this book by Jacques Maritain called The Primacy of the Spiritual. And the whole first chapter is about the indirect power of indirect authority of the spiritual power over the temporal power, meaning the church over the state and other temporal authorities. And he talks about how for spiritual reasons, the church has indirect power over the state as to the spiritual aspects of temporal matters. But that they don't have, and they also have direct authority over spiritual matters that are in themselves spiritual, but they don't have direct authority over things that are temporal. But now here we have, this is a little bit of a tangent, but here we have bishops exercising their direct spiritual authority over spiritual things for purely temporal reasons, even if it is dressed up. I don't want to be cynical because some of these bishops were sincere at the beginning, even if it is dressed up in language, in sort of like spiritual language or sort of humanistic, moralistic language of protecting our neighbor and things like that. It still is essentially for the reasons of bodily health.
Yes. Yes. And by the way, I read a lot of bishop statements during the lockdown, and some of them were, as you suggest, they were phrased in religious language. Some of them weren't at all. Some of them were very legalistic, very bureaucratic, almost taking the tone, I know you sneaky people, you're going to try to get to Mass, and I won't have it. And there wasn't, it would have, maybe I wouldn't have been so exercised about the whole thing if I saw more of the spirit of the spiritual father, and less of the bureaucrat in these statements.
Yes. And you even mentioned that some of the statements didn't even come from the bishop directly. They came from the chancery.
Right. And I've made the point that a few friends of mine asked bishops, are you giving us this guidance as an order under obedience? And without exception, they did not get a straight answer.
So when you refer to the order, are you referring to the order to priests to not make masses open to the public, or are you referring to, well, has there ever been an order for the lay people not to attend?
Well, you can't attend if there's no mass to.
Well,
I can't think of an order for lay people not to attend mass.
So you're speaking about orders to priests.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yes.
Pastors.
Yes.
Okay. CatholicCulture.org is funded almost entirely by user donations. That means everything from our articles on commentary, news, liturgical year stuff on the website, as well as our podcasts and videos. All of those are maintained basically by your generosity. So during this Easter season, we're running a fundraising campaign in which a few of our key donors have generously offered us a $50,000 matching grant. If you, our listeners and readers, can collectively scrounge up 50 grand, that amount will be matched by these donors. This fundraising is essential to keep our work going. And by the way, the podcasts really tend to cost a lot more money to make than they take in by way of donation. So I would love to have some of our podcast listeners and YouTube audience get more involved in supporting our work. So to do that, you can go on over to catholicculture.org/donate/audio, and your donation will be earmarked specifically for our audio and video content, actually. Basically all of our podcasts. If now's not the right time for you to make a contribution, then please at least throw us some prayers, and we'll be very grateful for that. Well, one of the most, I think, helpful parts of the book, perhaps on a spiritual level, is your discussion of how a lot of these statements about the suspension of Sunday, the obligation of Sunday Mass, fell short. So you take the position, correct me if I'm wrong, that this is a precept of the Church to attend Mass on Sundays. It's based on a divine law, but the way in which the way in which we obey this divine law, specifically by going to Mass on Sundays, is something that the Church can dispense from for various reasons.
Yes.
Now that I don't think that question has actually been settled theologically. In other words, whether this is sort of a necessary divine precept and the Church can only say that for grave reason you can miss Mass, rather than actually dispensing from the law itself or changing the law itself, if that makes sense. But I think you can take it for the sake of argument that the Church could even change this specific requirement or this specific expression of the Sabbath obligation, if it wanted to. I don't think that will ever happen. But why is it that? Well, how did various bishops approach that? Because some of them, you mentioned, didn't even explicitly suspend the obligation, but they made it impossible to fulfill it. So give us a picture of kind of the messages being sent with these kind of convoluted restrictions and the different approaches bishops took to the Sunday obligation on a legal level.
Well, on a legal level, at least a couple of the statements that I saw were incoherent, because they said, just as you relate, they said, there will be no public celebration of the Mass, but they did not say you're dispensed from your obligation. So now, if you live in that diocese, of course, you can't be obligated to do something that it's impossible to do. But it would be a relief, wouldn't it, for the bishop just to say you are dispensed? Most of them did say that you're dispensed. But the effect, I think you asked the effect, and I think the effect has been devastating. And I think that it will be lasting, because not only did the bishops tell people that there wouldn't be public celebration of the Mass, but they also said, well, don't worry about it. You can watch on live stream, or you can watch on TV from the convenience of your home. Well, it came very close in many instances to saying, and not, by the way, not just bishops, but pastors were saying the same thing. And the message I'm afraid that many people got was, it's just as good to live stream. It's just as good to have a virtual Mass. And so you don't have to, you shouldn't worry about it. In fact, that was definitely the tone of many of the bishops' statement was, you shouldn't worry about this. Don't, if you worry about this, you're being selfish in some respects. So, don't worry about it. You're fine. You're getting everything you need from the live stream. You say that for week after week, month after month. And then a time comes, and it's already come in some dioceses, where the bishop says, okay, now I am reinstituting the Sunday Mass obligation. There's no dispensation. I can't believe that you're going to see all those people return to church, because they've been hearing that it's just as good to watch on TV.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Cardinal Dolan made a statement later, about it's time to return to Sunday Mass. And in that statement, he took the position that the church can't dispense from the law itself of Sunday Mass, that this is essentially divine law, but that the church can say for this or that reason, individuals are, exempted, but that the law itself can't be changed, in other words. And I said, well, okay, but that's effectively what you did or tried to do. You made the decision for people.
Right. And in Boston, I quote in the book Cardinal O'Malley's pastoral letter that he issued just less than 10 years ago about Sunday Mass, saying we can't have a church without the Mass. And then he suspended the public celebration of the Mass. And, again, it's not the same to tell me and to tell you, don't worry, there are priests celebrating Mass. So it's not that the Mass has been obliterated. Well, yeah, but I'm not there, and I can't be there. And that message, I can't tell you how frustrated and dismayed I was by that message. And by knowing that there were priests who were celebrating the Mass, who were administering the sacraments, who were pushing the envelope, if not outright defying orders from the chancery. And they were often seen as the problem children. Whereas the priests who said, oh, I don't have to celebrate Mass, I don't have to get confessions, I can go to my vacation house and go fishing, they weren't problems. And there's something really wrong there.
Yeah, I mean, even aside from priests, defying orders or instructions or what have you, bishops were even cracking down on priests who weren't doing that, but were just being creative and, going out of the way to find ways to give people the sacraments in other ways while still respecting the public health decrees.
Yes. And we were blessed because our pastor was one of the more inventive priests, and he was early with the parking lot masses and confessions in the cemetery and so forth. And I'm forever grateful to him for that. But I know that he felt the chancery was looking carefully and skeptically at some of his efforts.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You talk about the bishops kind of either obeying direct orders from public health authorities or simply just mimicking the guidelines given to other organizations by public health authorities or government officials. What about bishops going beyond those measures or almost anticipating them aggressively?
Yes, as some did. Yeah, I remember. I think it was I don't want to get this wrong, but I think it was the bishops of Ohio who announced very early on last year that there would be a lockdown. There would be no more celebration of the Mass, public celebration, until after Easter. And that shocked me at the time. Well, of course, now most dioceses, or some dioceses at least, we went 2 Easters without a normal public celebration. But that was at a time before the state was locked down. There's another bishop who said that there would be, he would not return to normal public celebration of the Mass until all restrictions were lifted. You say all restrictions? Because who knows when all restrictions will be lifted. So yeah, there are quite a few instances where they went beyond. And I think part of that was, part of it was an understandable desire to convince public authorities that the Catholic Church was going to be a good citizen, that you weren't going to have to worry about a super spreader event in the Catholic Church. And by the way, there's been no such event. But another part of it was just, I guess it's part of this health first heresy, as Douglas Farrell has put it, I think on your podcast, that it's so important. We're going to do everything we can to ensure that there's no risk to our people. And, now I say that, and I say, of course you do everything you can, but everything within reason, everything that you can without compromising the mission of the Church.
There's also, there's the public relations aspect of it as well. I mean, the Church is going to look like a jerk if the Church is, not going along with what they're told to do. They're going to be the ones taking the flack for being callous and, killing grandma and everything else. And, the venom, the degree to which there's actual hatred of people who disagree on the precautions that need to be taken, or different scientific opinions about this virus and preventing it is amazing. I mean, and also simply the kind of the willingness to strip people of their rights. I mean, we even had one of the signers of this awful EPPC statement about the vaccines, Dominican Father Nicanor Austriaco at Providence College. I mean, he even said in a piece, I think it was in Public Discourse, that he suggested that people who don't get the vaccine should be kept out of airports, should be, kept out of various events and basically public social life. So if even a Catholic priest, a Dominican theologian a Dominican ethicist, bioethicist, scientist, I guess you could call him, is saying this, imagine the hostile response if the Church as a whole were to, take an even sort of mildly less cautious stand, let alone an aggressive stance against overcaution. I mean, I saw some of this response on social media when that Supreme Court decision was made with the Brooklyn diocese. And people were just furious, and they were, I saw so many people commenting about these people are jam-packed into churches. They're all singing loudly. I'm like, you've never stepped you've never stepped into a church. I mean, set aside before the pandemic, right? Because we could be plenty sarcastic about that. But I've never seen people packed in virtually ever since the pandemic in a Catholic church in New York. Even ones that were pretty well attended on Sundays were still pretty well spaced out. I mean, the only exception would essentially be the Triduum at my parish, thankfully. But gosh, there's no packing in happening. But people think they know that these religious people are doing this. It's crazy.
Well, let's be honest and acknowledge that this is because the spirit of anti-Catholicism is abroad.
Mm-hmm.
And there are two aspects that I would point out about that. The first is the bishops and the pastors, and to a large extent the Catholic laity, are still reeling from the sex abuse crisis and don't want a conflict with public authority again. Don't want a conflict with the public media again either. Tired of being the bad guys, want to be the good guys.
Yep.
And okay, that's understandable, if not particularly noble. But the other aspect of it that I would like to call attention to, and I try to make this point and also in Contagious Faith, is that you have to be prudent enough to see where this is going. If there are restrictions imposed on public life of Americans and people elsewhere because of what's good for society, how long do you think it will take before liberals, before anti-Catholics want to impose those restrictions on the Catholic Church? I mean, don't you see it coming? Don't you see it on the horizon?
Yeah.
That time after time, state after state, where they list essential services that can be open, and churches are not on the list.
Yeah.
What is that telling you? It's
the sad thing, as with so many things, I think this could have been nipped in the bud pretty well as far as restrictions were concerned. With not even a unified front, but just a sufficient small number of bishops and priests willing to be fined, willing to be arrested, perhaps.
Yes.
Because the public relations battle, I can see that being much more difficult. It'll be much more difficult to win that battle and not have the church demonized over that. But the battle over simply civil rights and religious freedom, if people were willing to just stand in that and be uncomfortable, that really, I don't believe that would have been, I don't want to say it wouldn't have been difficult, but it wouldn't have. I think it's very doable to fight some of those restrictions. If just a few bishops had been willing to do it head on, to force a confrontation.
I agree with you. I'm definitely inclined in that direction myself. I did have an interesting conversation with Archbishop Corleone from San Francisco about that. And I told him that I thought if he were willing to just defy the local government orders, which were absurd at that time in San Francisco, and get himself arrested, I said I thought public opinion would be on his side. And he said, oh, if I thought, I think I'm going to quote him accurately now, if I thought they'd arrest me, I'd do it. He didn't think they'd arrest him. He thought they'd take it out on small parishes. Nickel-diming the church, putting the Board of Health at the small parishes, enforcing parking regulations aggressively, that sort of thing, which is pretty easy to do.
Yeah. But that's just, I think that's just going to be how it's going to have to be if we're going to get through this. I mean, you have to, we're so well past the breaking point here, what should have been the breaking point, that it's almost a shame if we get through this, and what the bishops want to happen is for this to be over soon and to just go through it without a confrontation. Well, that's bad. If the precedent is set without a confrontation, I don't count it as a victory. Are you there?
Yeah, something just happened. I went offline for a minute.
Okay. I was just saying, I don't count it as a victory if we get through this and just by nature taking its course, the church is let out of this tricky situation, because it's a precedent, and it doesn't mean that it's going to be the next time that it doesn't mean that it's the precedent for the next virus. We don't know what it's a precedent for. It's a precedent for all manner of things. I don't think that it's the permanent lockdown is the goal of the necessarily the goal of the most wicked powers on this planet. I don't know that that's to their benefit. I think this is pushing in a different direction that we can't necessarily predict. It's as much the compliance as it is anything else. The object of that compliance is not necessarily important. The other reason that it's not, that I don't count that as a victory, is that it doesn't really speak well of the Catholic people and the Catholic clergy. It doesn't speak well of our values, of what we are willing to do to have the sacraments and to glorify God.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's when you say it's a precedent and it's not necessarily for a virus, let me just suggest there will be another virus. I mean, there's a flu every year. Now, I'm not saying the COVID is just a flu. I'm saying there is a flu every year.
Right.
And so next winter, when there's a new flu, and let's hope it's a mild one, as they usually are, there will be people saying you should close the churches because people are going to get the flu. And what is the logic that leads you to say, no, we're not going to do that?
Right.
Because that logic seems to have been wiped out in this instance.
And now we've got people who are going well beyond the restrictions even of the CDC, which are themselves fairly absurd in some instances. And people saying, I don't know, even if I get vaccinated, I'm going to stay home. So we've got now this genuine, what started as something else, perhaps genuine mental illness in some cases with some people. And those people are going to be hopefully in the small minority and basically ignored or helped to get out of that by the rest of us. But yeah, those people certainly will be calling for similar responses to other diseases.
But let's look on the bright side, because as you say, a precedent has been set, and I totally agree with you, and I think it will be very hard to walk it back. Having said that, there are also a lot of people who have sort of counted the costs and made a decision. And I am finding that the people who are making the effort to get to Mass, particularly, by the way, get to Mass daily.
Yes.
And you see a different crowd at daily Mass, a different sort of crowd. It's one more thing that gives Catholics and all Christians an opportunity to decide what's really important to them. And those who make the right decision, who honor their faith, who decide that it's worth the risk, are much more likely to be evangelical, and they're much more likely to be a force for change, both in the church and society. So I see this as one of the many things that's pushing us towards what Pope Benedict talked about, a smaller but more evangelical, more energetic, more committed church.
Yeah, amen to that.
The numbers very likely will be down. They have been going down anyway. I think they're probably going to take a big dip, but the commitment level, I think, is going to ratchet up.
Yeah, so do we have any data on this, people coming back to Sunday Mass?
I don't have anything reliable at this point yet.
Okay. Well, okay, we can lead into a different topic, which is the changes to the liturgy themselves in response to this. I was just speaking with my parish's music director the other night, who was thankful that such a large number of people were coming back at our parish. And the reason he thought that was because we were not making it so unpleasant to come back as some parishes were. Now we could talk about the liturgy itself or just the requirements to get in the door. The one very memorable paragraph in your book is you say, bishops who had never worried about the proper reception of communion now gave explicit instructions on the sanitation of the process. In short, bishops who had not previously evinced any real concern about the rubrics of the Eucharistic liturgy now went into excruciating detail, in one case, a 63-page memo about how the liturgy should be celebrated. After decades of neglect, which helped to cause a crisis of faith, it took a public health crisis to focus attention on liturgical guidelines, and now when the focus finally was placed on liturgical propriety, the goal was not reverence, but hygiene.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah. Well, I mean, Uh,
Yeah.
have you gone to churches? I certainly have, where right front and center in front of the altar, there's a pedestal with a bottle of sanitizer on it, where the sanitizing
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
priest's hands and the hands of the countless Eucharistic ministers is, it looks like the high point of the Mass. Um, it's all out of proportion, and it's done
Yeah.
real damage to the liturgy.
Well, I've went to a church in New York several months ago in Manhattan. One of the few Catholic churches in Manhattan that looks like an ugly modernist
Mm.
suburban church, because most of them are quite beautiful, regardless of the state of the parish. Um, and I went, and the priest gave the final blessing before communion, and then everybody received and filed right out of the church. And my mind was blown by this. I thought this was like the worst abuse I had ever seen. And then I found out that that's actually happening in a lot of places. And perhaps even the bishops are, in some places, are saying this should be done, which is just absolutely insane to me. We're reordering the parts of the Mass and just having people receive
How?
communion and
Yeah,
walk out the door.
right.
Based on what? For
And
what health
first of all, I
purpose?
don't see how that promotes any health issue at all. But it's such a blow to reverence for the Eucharist, or to being reflected at the time of communion. The idea of you take communion and
Yeah,
you walk
absolutely.
out and get in your car and drive home immediately, and we're done that. It's really undermining respect for the Eucharist, which is obviously central to any liturgy.
Okay, so we've been talking about the response of the clergy here. That's obviously not something that the faithful can necessarily do a lot about directly, other than praying and exhorting and rebuking as appropriate. Um, but the faithful can choose to go to Mass in ways that are available to them. Let's say most places Mass is available legally. I think it's pretty clear that the lay people are allowed to attend unauthorized masses. Now, this is separate from the question of whether priests can disobey an order from their bishop, whether the bishop has the authority to completely stop masses as opposed to regulate some aspect of them or things like that, or prevent, public health, immoral public figures from receiving communion, the things that we normally associate with the duty of the bishop. That's a separate question. Um, but we're
Mm.
allowed to attend, for example, Orthodox masses. We're allowed to attend SSPX masses. So those are things that don't necessarily have authorization from the local bishop, and yet we're allowed to attend them. So I think it's pretty clear that a Catholic, unless he is like encouraging a sinful act of disobedience, a Catholic is allowed to attend and sort of illicit
I
mass.
guess
Correct?
so. I think you'd get an argument on whether it is sinful to attend Mass um, at an Orthodox church, say, when a Catholic church is available.
Yes. Yes, that's
In
true.
certain
But we are allowed
circumstances,
to
yes.
in certain circumstances. That's
Yes,
explicitly said by the church. I'm not
right.
up on the details of under what circumstances, but um so do you have
Well,
anything more to say about that?
um,
I thought you were about to
yeah,
say
I'm
something else. I just
trying to
wanted to
decide
give you a
whether I want to
chance to.
say it. I put it this way:
Okay.
if there's another lockdown, I'm going to get to Mass by hook or by crook. If the bishop says there are no churches
Right.
open, I will find a way. And if that way is
Right.
unauthorized, uh, I am inviting any priest who wants to be disobedient. I mean, as I say, whatever it takes. And I know I'm not alone.
Yeah. You cite the canon law. Sacred ministers cannot deny the sacraments to those who seek them at appropriate times, are properly disposed, and are not prohibited by
Right.
law from receiving them.
I don't know of any
How does that
law
apply to this
here.
situation?
Bishops made policies. I don't know of any law. So the question is, am I properly disposed? And the presumption always is heavily in favor of the communicant.
Yeah. Right. Now, I mentioned this Maritain book I've been reading, and it's been forming my thoughts on this as I approach this discussion, because I happen to be reading it at the same time. He cites Bellarmine and Augustine talking about the obedience owed to the Pope, that we must obey our superiors if there's uncertainty as to whether obeying the order is sinful or manifestly harmful to the common good. If there's uncertainty, if it's not manifestly sinful or manifestly harmful, we must obey it. But one reasons that, in Catholic theology, that one may disobey the Pope include if he tells you to do something that's sinful, but also if he tells you to do something that is clearly subversive of the common good of the church. And this would obviously apply a fortiori to obedience to bishops. So I think there is an argument there. Obviously, this is something any priest would have to approach with fear and trembling. I mean, it makes me nervous just thinking about it. What a horrible thing, because the priest theologically celebrates Mass as an extension of his local bishop under normal circumstances. That goes right back to, I think, St. Ignatius of Antioch. But I think we're getting to that point where this stuff is indisputably harmful to the common good of the church, and it is indisputably an abuse of the rights of the faithful. So I'm not telling anybody what to do, but it seems to me that we're getting to a point where that would be more clear to priests examining their conscience in this
yes,
matter.
and priests also make a vow of obedience to their bishops, which they have to take seriously. So it's a different issue for priests. And for lay people,
absolutely, yeah,
I think so. I think
it's much easier for us.
Whatever we feel we need to do, and we have a pretty broad spectrum of options, or at least we should. And if there are some places where people are welcome in time of need, welcome to the sacraments, they are going to get there. I mean, I mentioned that my parish, the pastor was aggressive, and when things did start opening up a little bit, our parish was pretty full of people coming from elsewhere where they were not able to get the sacraments, and here they were, and they were also grateful. And it's not a coincidence that it's a pretty healthy parish. And so people get there from elsewhere and they say, gee, I like it here, and they stay. And so there's going to be a winnowing out. And I think that too is a process that was happening anyway, where people, most people drive to church anyway. Yeah. And, if you drive an extra 5 minutes on Sunday, that's not really a big deal.
Right, sure. I mentioned my parish music director's comment about parishes making it unpleasant to come back to Mass. So let's talk a little bit about the requirements to get in the door. What are some of the different requirements that parishes have placed
lots
on their parishioners to even
registering in advance, of course, wearing a mask. Some places where children were not invited, which, by the way, what on earth? How does that match the gospel? And what does that do with parents with little families with little children? The registering in advance was one that troubled me. Now, I've heard more recently people who are vaccinated get to sit in one side of the church. Those who are not vaccinated have to go on another side. There's all sorts of, taking temperatures on the way in. I think most of this is lightening up, but there's still, in most of the churches, at least most churches I see, every other pew is roped off. The mask mandate is fairly universal. No, I shouldn't say that. It's very much enforced in some churches and completely ignored in others. There's all
right. Such as the one that we
right.
met at.
And by the way,
around
no
Christmas
coincidence.
time.
We had both
Yeah.
driven a ways to get there, as I recall. Right.
Yes, and it was packed, packed with families. So what about the conscience of? So let me rephrase that. If somebody is required to sign up, if their pastor says you have to register and for contact tracing, essentially, to come to mass. I mean, I think that's clearly obviously wrong for the pastor to do that, but is the parishioner obligated to do so? Can I just walk in past the contract, the form person, whoever's administering that, and just say, you know what, I have a right to the sacraments, and there's no law, there's no church law saying that I have to do this.
Are you saying, will the usher let you in? I don't know. How big are you? And how scary are you? But absolutely, you have the right to do that.
Yeah.
By the way, I can understand, I could understand in some circumstances where the congregation was limited to a small number. And the pastor said, please sign up, just so we have an idea of the numbers, particularly in places where the pastors were making sure there were a whole lot of masses being said on Sunday, so everybody could get in. I understand that. It was more onerous, I thought, when you had to sign up for confession.
Oh, yeah.
Where was it I saw recently where someone was saying, a bishop in Ontario was saying that confession should be discouraged. Confessions should be discouraged, he said, unless there's a serious matter. So what do you say? You give your.
But he said blood drives were still essential functions of the parish hall.
Yes. But I mean, the abuse of the sacrament, when you have to call your priest and say, can you hear my confession? Because I really have to go, then you've essentially made a confession right there without benefit of the seal.
Yeah. Well, at my parish, we had to make appointments, but we did not have to sign up. We didn't have to give our name or anything like that. So we just had to call and say, I'm going to be here at this time. There was basically a set time, and we just had to call and tell them we'll have to be that we would be there at the time, so that the priest would know to be in there. And this was I mean, this was during the lockdown. This was not this was like during the spring and summer last year.
Yeah, that's not unreasonable, but you do have the right to an anonymous confession.
Absolutely. So switching gears a little bit, I want to go to, and this doesn't necessarily have only to do with the church, but kind of this idea of, we already discussed the fact that we already do take risks, and we do, in a sense, put a price on human life in determining, as a society, in determining what risks we are and aren't willing to expose people in the society to, so that society can function in a normal and healthy way, such as, driving, just the normal spread of disease under normal circumstances, things like that. Now, people talk about it's not about protecting yourself, it's about protecting others. I want to ask, and obviously you could do a whole episode on this, but how far does the obligation to protect others from the risk of disease go? Because we're hearing that even if other people are vaccinated, we have a moral obligation to get vaccinated ourselves in case those vaccinated people are among the small percentage of people who might still be vulnerable to the virus, just as an example. So how do you kind of cut off things and say, well, no, I'm not actually beyond a certain point obligated to protect other people from risk?
It's a good question. I do think it's perfectly sensible to say, as most priests are saying, if you're sick, stay home, because you are then a risk. And by the way, that's not just COVID. That's
even in much even in any disease that's not going to kill anybody. You don't want to get the whole parish
Right. And
a nasty
just a
cold.
normal flu, you would say, yeah, stay home. But do the math a little bit. What are the odds that I am infected right now? They're very low. If I am infected, what are the odds that I'm going to communicate it to you? They're very low. And if I do communicate it to you, what are the odds that you're going to get seriously sick? Very low. And, you multiply out, you do the probability function, and you find out that the odds of my actually making you sick are vanishingly small, vanishingly small. So even if you accept the notion that I should do whatever I can to keep you healthy, it's weighed in the balance. I'm much more likely to do damage to you in a car accident driving to church than breathing once I'm in the church. And nobody's telling me that I shouldn't drive to church. That's one thing that, by the way, was never forbidden.
Right. You mentioned in the book, I thought this was very helpful, the normal distinction between ordinary and extraordinary means of medical care. How would that apply to this?
Well, that was Bishop Paprocki, I think, who introduced that notion, to me at least. And he made the point that Catholic teaching has always suggested that in cases of healthcare, you don't have to use extraordinary means. That usually we think of this in end-of-life decisions where, you are not obligated to do something out of the ordinary to keep someone alive, when it's very unlikely to succeed. Or even if it's likely to succeed, but it's extraordinary, it's painful to the individual, and it would just prolong death rather than prolong life. And he applied that to this situation where he said, do you have to take extraordinary means to protect people from disease? And obviously this is a sliding scale. It depends on the severity of the disease. But in this case, it sure looks like extraordinary means. We have taken extraordinary means to prevent the spread of this virus. And what has it cost to our society, to our church, to ourselves?
And it's pretty clearly wrong to force. It's pretty clearly wrong, immoral to force extraordinary means on others, either for their own sake or for the sake of a third party.
Right. Yes. You're never obligated, and you shouldn't be required to use extraordinary means. So, again, how much, if you are living with a hypochondriac, and I think we all are at this point, we're living in a hypochondriac society, and, you're not supposed to exhale, or how far do you have to go to humor people who are making irrational demands?
Yeah. So let's talk about witness. I wish I had brought this up earlier, actually, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the kind of the different manifestations of this fear. But what you talk in the book about how the early Christians, we can be pretty certain that under this circumstance, they would have kept going to Mass. We know this because we know what they did do when they were risking martyrdom. And you can now somebody might say, well, they were risking themselves. They weren't risking others by going. Well, yes, they were actually in plenty of circumstances. On our other podcast, Catholic Culture audiobooks, we just had a dramatized reading of the martyrdom account of Saint Perpetua and Felicity. And, aside from exposing other people to danger of death or torture or anything like that, Saint Perpetua's father came to her and begged her, I'm an old man. Don't expose me to this suffering, in my old age. Just do what you have to do to avoid martyrdom. And she refused. But that was a pull on her heartstrings because he was genuinely suffering as a result of her choice to be martyred. So that's unavoidable. We can't. There are certain things that we must do, even if they will cause a certain amount of suffering to others. Of course, that's putting aside the fact that the risk is fairly low in this circumstance. But we know that they would have been willing to suffer this level of risk to themselves and perhaps even to people that they loved to attend Mass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and take it a little further. Let's suppose that the disease was as communicable and as deadly as we were originally led to believe. What should you do? I think what I would want to do is go to Mass, go to the sacraments, because that's how I would want to live my life, particularly if I thought I was in imminent danger of death. And I hope that there would be enough people who felt the same way to make an impression on the society around us that these are people who actually believe what they profess. And it would make them want to know, what is it about the Mass? What is it about the faith that these people are willing to take this risk for?
Yeah. I mean, people can talk all they want about, how we're showing our brotherly love and stuff, but we have in no way distinguished ourselves as a church from the rest of the culture and how we've responded to this.
No, we haven't, except possibly by issuing more papers about what our procedures are going to be, what
Right.
our public health procedures are going to be. Yeah. We have not looked like the early Christians. We haven't looked like people who are willing to die for the faith. Or, I mean, the point I'm trying to make, even just live for the faith, just live a normal life. And because the fear is unworthy of Christians, the kind of fear that we're experiencing, that we're seeing all around us. It's not worthy of people who understand that we're not going to die. I mean, we will experience death, but we will also live forever. The fear of death, the inordinate fear that we see all around us, is manifestation of a lack of faith.
There's another aspect of this too. I believe, I can't quite remember in detail, but I believe in the Borromeo quote that you had about how he responded to this near the beginning of the book. Did he not refer to this plague that they were suffering as, a chastisement of some kind?
He may have. He also, I thought you were going to say, I'm pretty sure, I have to look it out myself, but I'm pretty sure he told the priests that if they contracted the plague while ministering to the people, it was their, express ticket to heaven, essentially.
Right.
He didn't put it that way, obviously.
Right. But, well, anyway, forget that quote. We could say more generally that, the church has kind of, or let's say Catholic preaching has kind of done a lot to eradicate this very traditionally Catholic Old Testament and New Testament and beyond idea that natural disasters, contagious diseases, things like that, can be treated as a chastisement from God, that they should be interpreted spiritually in this way without thinking overly that exactly why, or whether it's a punishment versus a, purification, or any number of other factors, that the disease itself has a spiritual element to it, and that should affect how we respond to it.
Yes, I don't know about chastisement. I don't know what we'd be chastised for. There's plenty.
Right.
But I think without question, we're going through a period of purification. And the last, 20, 30 years for any serious Catholic in the United States, particularly, that. We're going through something extraordinary that should lead to reform of the church, because it should tear away some of the smug self-satisfaction that's always an enemy of spiritual growth.
Well, let me take another tack to this. I believe that Borromeo said that people should be praying to God and offering these masses for the removal of this danger,
yes,
the removal of this disease. And that itself implies that there's an element of God's will here. Everything that happens to us is God's will. At the very least, it's God's permissive will. But, so far as we're concerned, we may as well act for our spiritual purposes as though it's God's will, simply speaking. So that kind of attitude of a prayerful response and actually believing that if this is a serious problem, then we need to appeal to God's will. We need to submit to God's will, but we also need to appeal to God's will in prayer, to God's salvific will in a spiritual and material sense. So that's something that's been almost completely lacking. We did see a few good bishops like Bishop Strickland, for example, and others doing Eucharistic processions, even by car in some cases, in their diocese early on, as a way of honoring God and appealing to Him for aid. But we should really take this idea seriously, that this reality seriously, that our prayers actually are effective. They are perhaps a far more effective way of saving lives. Not perhaps, definitely a far more effective way of saving lives than are many of these lockdowns and measures that are now, some of them, shown to be even counterproductive.
Right. Oh, yeah. Well, this is fundamental message that I try to get across in this book, is that there is reason for hope. And the reason for hope is Jesus Christ. The reason for hope is not a face mask. It's not a vaccine. These things are not going to cure our problem, in the sense that even if they do protect us from COVID, we'll die of something else. If you're looking for eternal life, if you're looking to avoid death, there's only one way to do it. And this is the message of the church. It's a shocking message, when you see it in the Acts of the Apostles, when you see it in the early church fathers, they have this very clear sense that what they're saying is shocking. And it should be shocking. It should be shocking in our age. And maybe people would be more open to it when they realize the futility of the gestures that they're currently absorbed with. Right.
So, yeah, I think that Catholics, we pay a lot of lip service to the idea of praying for things, but we have this we've absorbed this scientific mindset to such a degree. It's like with what I was saying about seeing natural disasters as an expression of God's will in some sense or another. We kind of shy back from saying that. We kind of say, well, no, it's really a product of these material causes and God's simply allowing it, but it's not specifically meant for our good by God in some way, or in this case that we were just discussing, the idea that prayer actually genuinely is the most effective way, even for our material benefit. Mm-hmm. And that there's no opposition between taking prudential steps to help oneself materially and praying, and that it is itself a prudential judgment as to whether one at a certain point needs to say, what, at this point it's in God's hands, because there are no more reasonable steps that we can take.
Yes, that's sanity. To say you do what you can, and having done what you can, you say, okay, now it's in God's hands, and having placed in God's hands, I can ask for His mercy, for His assistance, for His forbearance, whatever. But that's sanity, to recognize that you can't do it yourself.
Well, it would seem that sanity is a gift of the Holy Spirit. I think that's becoming increasingly clear in our time. It's not a natural. Apparently. It's not a natural virtue.
Apparently so.
So I'm glad we've touched on a more hopeful note here. I wanted to go back to one practical point. You mentioned a suggestion made by a French bishop. I think his name was Montauban. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that properly, but he suggested that in cases of public health authorities, as are still in some cases, most nearly to us in Canada, where the situation is just absolutely horrendous right now.
Yes.
That people should just show up at the church at a time decided for Mass, and that, if they did that enough, then the priests would come and say Mass. What's your thought about that kind of strategy?
I like the idea. I don't know if it would work. I mean, you still do have to have a willing priest.
Yeah.
But I know that there are certainly many priests who would be very happy to do that. I suppose I can now say that I sort of did that myself very early on. I guessed at when the priest would be saying his private Mass, and I made a visit to the church, and I was right. So I was able to attend Mass, and he was happy to have me there.
Great.
But maybe it could be done more formally. I hope and pray we don't come to that we're not going to have another lockdown. That would be so disastrous.
Well, it comes down so much to this issue of needing to force a confrontation and to take initiative. It's really disturbing to me, as I said, that the church is so much following and not leading, even as things do return to normal, which is of course a good thing, but it's still a foreboding thing that the church is following and not leading.
Right. Yes.
So, we talked about the church needing to force, because so much damage could have been averted if a confrontation with the civic authorities and with public opinion had been forced earlier. There's also the confrontation that is forced in a manner of speaking. If a large number of people show up to their church for Mass and no priest is there, you're making a strong statement. Let's say the priest doesn't show up. Everybody's there. The public health authorities are already being defied. So in that sense, you're forcing a confrontation because the police may show up and break it up. And then the priest and the bishop are sort of put in a position where they have to do something, Right. They may throw their parishioners under the bus if they're really wicked, but that's still something, that's still something. Reality being forced to sort of come out into the open. So people could show up and the priest doesn't come up. At least they're all praying in common. That's something that's valuable. Now, the Protestants, we can see that the Protestants who don't have the sacrament still value that. And that probably is a lesson in itself, to Catholics, because we so often don't gather for communal prayer anymore, except in the home, except for when there's an actual liturgy or sacrament going on. But there's also this, I think it applies all down the line because, I had never once received communion on my hand, I don't think, in my life until this pandemic. And I was put into positions where I had to, or was encouraged to, and even refused communion on the tongue a couple times by priests, which I found to be a very disturbing and humiliating and horrifying experience. So I kind of backed down for a while, and I kind of said, you know what, I don't even want to put myself in that situation. It's such an unpleasant thing to, it makes me want to cry when that happens. So I don't even want to go there. So I was almost making the priest decision for them, just as the churches, some of the bishops have made the public health authorities decision for them. We're not going to force them to order us to do this. We're going to preempt them.
Right.
In doing this. So I was almost doing that for a while, which I regret. And at a certain point, I turned around and said, you know what? I'm never going to receive communion on the hand again unless I am forced to do so. Now, if a priest refuses me communion on the tongue, I'm not going to make a big scene in the church, even though he's denying me my right according to the church's authority. I'm not going to make a scene. I'm going to refuse on the hand, and Jesus knows that I hate to do that and I don't prefer that. But then I'm doing something. I do feel that I'm doing something for the priest in that situation by going up and sticking my tongue out and not deciding the issue beforehand and giving him the luxury of not having to feel uncomfortable. I want him to have to make that choice, to be forced to make a decision and to have his conscience ping instead of making it comfortable as though there's no choice being made, as though he's not making a decision, as though he's not responsible, because everybody is making it easier for everybody else up the line of the hierarchy. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm with you entirely. I'm all for forcing people to make decisions.
So
And I think,
I'm not, trying to be obnoxious or a jerk. Like I said, I'm not going to make a scene, but I am going to take that little moment and suffer the salutary humiliation myself and give the priest the opportunity to feel uncomfortable as he should in such a circumstance.
well, you're also giving him the opportunity to do the right thing.
Exactly. Everybody's letting everybody off the hook in this way by having low expectations. It's not that we as the faithful rebel against our properly constituted authorities in the church, but we present ourselves by being who we are and not kind of shrinking and receding whenever our leaders do that. I think that
Right.
in itself is a challenge. I guess that's what I'm getting at.
And I totally agree. I think shrinking and receding, like being fearful, are unworthy of Christians.
Yeah. Do you have any final comment you'd like to make before we wrap up here?
I guess I'd just say that, well, of course, I hope everybody runs out and buys the book. And by the way, if you buy it direct from Sophia Press, you get the same price as Amazon, and you don't give any money to Amazon.
Word.
That's, but I'd like to emphasize what I was saying, that we have an obligation, we have a duty to spread our faith, and we don't spread our faith by hiding it under a bushel, and we don't spread our faith by being timid. And we have shown too much timidity in the last year, and more than a year now. And we should be thinking, when we went through the second Easter without a proper public celebration, we should have been telling ourselves, we can never do this again. No matter what, we can never do this again. We have to celebrate our faith. In the meaning of celebration, it has to be public. It has to be a witness.
Amen. Well, thank you, Phil. It was good to finally do a full episode with you here. I appreciate your coming on.
Oh, thanks for doing it. I think it's my first on-camera appearance.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
So it's a good experience for me.
Well, everybody, thank you for listening. Again, the book is Contagious Faith, out from Sophia Institute Press, and I'll link to that in the show notes. If you're watching this on YouTube, please click subscribe on the channel. I'm hoping that YouTube won't ban my channel just for this video. The next episode is going to be a return of our previous guest, Michael Pekalik, who I just had on talking about his new translation of the Gospel of John. And next we'll have him on, I believe, with a couple of other guests as well, to talk about the morality of beings. And that episode will not be on YouTube. That episode is going to be on Rumble, because I don't want to risk getting my channel banned or even going through the pain of having the video itself removed, even if that's all that would happen. So what I'm going to do is I'll post a little video on YouTube when that comes out, directing you to the full conversation on Rumble. So that'll be next episode. You can look forward to that. That's why we didn't really talk about the Maxians, as I've heard some people call it, to try to avoid YouTube censorship. They've called the virus the beer bug, and come up with all these different euphemisms to avoid the censors. But I think in order to not give myself a headache, I'll just use the real words and put the video somewhere else.